Shalom, everyone, and welcome to the third program in the Talking Memory series, Grossaktion Warsaw, Remembering 80 Years Later, marking the 80th anniversary of the Great Deportation that began on July 22nd and ended on September 21st, 1942. The topic of today's program is the Hippocratic Oath at the Umschlagplatz, the Jewish doctors of the Warsaw Ghetto. On today's program, we have an amazing list of speakers, and I am so honored that they are with us today. Opening remarks will be given by Dr. Hadas Shasha-Lavksy, and the host for this program will be Tali Nates, founding director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Guest speakers are Dr. Maria Ciesielska, Luc Albinski, and Dr. Michael Katz. And my name is Medin Shachar, and I work at the Ghetto Fighters House as an educator and a guide. I want to welcome our global audience with a special welcome, as always, to those survivors and their families that are with us today. We want to thank everyone for their support and their interest in our programs. And today's program, as is the whole series on the Grossaktion Warsaw, is in partnership with the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Classrooms Without Borders, the Rabin Chair Forum at George Washington University, Moreshet Holocaust and Research Center, the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry at the University of Tel Aviv, the Polish Institute in Tel Aviv, and the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Today's program is the third in a four-part series that is exploring from different perspectives the Great Deportation, the Grossaktion, from the Warsaw Ghetto, looking at the life of the Jewish community behind the walls of the ghetto during the summer of 1942. The first program with Professor Chavi Dreyfus and Holocaust survivor Pinchas Guter set the background for this series with a description of the ghetto and the mindset of the Jews entrapped inside as the deportation approached. The second program with Dr. Katarzyna Persson and Noam Liebman dealt with the Jewish police in the ghetto and their role at the Umschlagplatz. And today's program will focus on the Jewish doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto. We are, like I said, so honored to have Dr. Hadas Shasha-Lavksy with us today to give the opening remarks. Just a few words about her and her work, and you'll understand the connection. Dr. Shasha-Lavksy is a pediatric nephrologist and the head of the pediatric nephrology unit in the Galilee Medical Center in Nahariya, Israel. Since 2021, she teaches and coordinates the Medicine and Holocaust course for medical students in the Faculty of Medicine at Bar Ilan in Tzfat. Since 2017, she has been a member of the organizing committee of the Nahariya Conference on Medicine and the Holocaust, a conference that was established and led by her father, Shaul Shasha, in 2000, together with the Ghetto Fighters House and the Western Galilee Academy. Since her father's passing last November, she has taken on the role of the chair of the organizing committee of this long-established conference. Her interest in medicine and the Holocaust came firstly as a result of collaborative research that she did with her father about long-term health outcomes in Holocaust survivors, which showed higher rates of morbidity and risk factors among the survivors. She is continuing this important research and now looking for morbidity and risk factors among second and third generation Holocaust survivors. She has also collaborated in a project to translate into Hebrew the starvation trial from the Warsaw Ghetto, a project that her father started but did not finish before he died. Dr. Shasha-Lavksy says that she continues his legacy and hopes to see the Hebrew edition in the near future. And with that, Dr. Shasha-Lavksy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madeleine. And I really want to thank you and the organizing committee for inviting me and the honor to speak here to open this important meeting. So as you said, I am a physician, a pediatric nephrologist, and I'm a second generation of physicians who are interested in medicine and the Holocaust. And my father, Shaul Shasha, exposed me to this fascinating and endless field. Usually when we say medicine and Holocaust, most people think about Nazi doctors and their crimes. And this is, of course, one aspect that is a dark and frightening side of medicine and Holocaust. And for us physicians, it brings many moral and ethical issues that we have to deal and think and learn from. But another side is the examples of the Jewish and the non-Aryan doctors who resist the Nazis in their own way, without weapons, but with their knowledge and their unbelievable power. They struggled to save lives that the Nazis thought were unworthy. From the time my father told me the story of Dr. Israel Milikovsky and the Jewish doctors in Warsaw Ghetto, I was trapped in the net. The title that Dr. Maria gave to her lecture, Superhuman Medicine, described it very well. The Jewish doctors and other non-Jewish colleagues fight the Nazis in their way by continuing treatments, smuggling drugs, inventing new therapies or vaccinations with no resources, and moreover, they continued research and medical education. They must have been superhumans. My father said, and I quote him, "It always brings me into tears what our colleagues did in conditions like hell." My father was so touched and excited from the story of Dr. Milikovsky and the story of the hunger disease study, and he looked for more information about Milikovsky. He got to Tadeusz Orlowski, who was the son of Witold Orlowski. Tadeusz Orlowski was also an nephrologist, and they met in international conferences, but they didn't know about this part of history that connected them beyond nephrology. I want to share with you a letter. So this is my father, Shaul Shasha, and this is Tadeusz Orlowski and his father, Witold Orlowski. And Tadeusz wrote to my father a letter in 2007, describing his part in the hunger disease study. He wrote, "I would like to remind you that two of the main authors of this monograph, Dr. Emil Effelbaum and Julian Fliederbaum, were for a long time members of staff of the second Department of Internal Medicine, and the head of the second department was Professor Witold Orlowski, his father." And he says, on the beginning of 1943, he called me and gave me a thick sealed envelope with documents and ordered me to carefully protect and hidden them. After the war, if he will not survive, it would be my duty to publish them. He did not inform me about the content of it. I had put the envelope into a metal can, sealed it with paraffin wax, and buried it under the bricked floor in the cellar of the pavilion of our department. These cellars were short with small dirty windows. They were never used. The access to them was free and nobody took care of them. So after reconstruction of the floor, I was quite certain that this was an ideal hiding place. Just after the liberation of Warsaw, I dug out the can and returned the envelope to Professor Witold Orlowski, who delivered it to Dr. Effelbaum. And this is the story about Tadeusz Orlowski and my father. And my father continued to do research about medicine and Holocaust. And in year 2000, 22 years ago, he established the annual conference on medicine and Holocaust in Nahariya with the Ghetto Fighters House, back then with Simcha Stein, who was the general manager of the Ghetto Fighters House. And this conference was held for consecutive 21 years when he was the chair of the conference. Every year, even in the Corona, we did a virtual meeting. And I came to this conference from the very beginning when I was a medical student, and afterwards when I was an intern, and during all my medical training, I learned from the stories, from the talks. There are many things that I think that thanks to my dear father, I had learned about them from my very first steps as a medical student. And it had a very important role in designing my medical education and my medical character. My father was frequently asked why, what was his interest in medicine and the Holocaust, because he came from Iraq. And he always said that the Holocaust is the most low and dark period for all mankind. And we, Jews, humans, and most of all physicians should study it and learn from this period in order to prevent these horrors to occur again. As Medin said, we collaborated on a research to explore the late morbidities of Holocaust survivors, and we found some higher incidence of specific morbidities in the medical in Holocaust survivors, and this was translated to reimbursement of these specific diseases for the Holocaust survivors. And in a way, it was a continuation of the hunger disease made by Milikowski and colleagues. And I think it was one of the most meaningful studies that I did and my father did, and I'm continuing to do now. And the last thing is the medicine and the Holocaust course that we started last year. Miriam Offer, an historian of the Holocaust and of medicine and the Holocaust from the Western Galil Academy, and me, and a physician and historian leading this course. And I want to share with you the feedbacks from our students after they finished the course, and just few sentences that they said, and I think that are very exciting and emphasize the importance of learning medicine and Holocaust. The doctors in Germany who joined the Nazis and participated in crimes of the Nazis in the Holocaust were educated on the same values that we learn, but took medicine in dark direction. Therefore, in my opinion, it is important to investigate and try to understand how it happened, why it happened, and how it can be prevented in the future. I think it's very important to be aware of this power, always ask ourselves if we are doing the right thing. As doctors, at the beginning of our training, it is important to know and learn about anatomy, physiology, and basic studies of medicine. And at the same time, to learn about history, and especially about the milestones and cases that signals to us what not to do. The doctor's degree comes with great responsibility and a huge impact on the entire population. This power must be used correctly and wisely for the benefit of society, and not as was done in the field of eugenics. So I want to thank again Madin and Igal for inviting me and for creating this platform that enables us to hear from Dr. Maria about her advanced research, and from Luc about his personal perspective as the grandson of one of the heroes of Warsaw Ghetto, Dr. Halina Rothstein. The medical resistance in the Holocaust should be remembered in our collective memory as part of the uprising of the ghettos. As Milikowski wrote to his colleagues, non omnis moriar, they will not wholly die. It is our duty to remember the legacy and spread it to the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hadas. Thank you for your words, and thank you for being inspired by your father and for continuing his work, and of course, adding your personal touch as well. And now I would like to invite my colleague and friend, Tali Nates, who will be the moderator for the next part of this event. She is the founding director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and a historian who lectures internationally on Holocaust education, genocide prevention, reconciliation, and human rights. Tali has presented at numerous international conferences, including at the United Nations, and just this past month, she was one of the recipients of the Goethe Medal from the Federal Republic of Germany. Congratulations. Today, she will also share with our audience her connection to Dr. Ciesielska's work and to Luc Albinski, his mother, Wanda Albinska, and the documentary about his family, Nobody Told Me. Tali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Medin, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's just wonderful to be with all of you and to speak about a project that I am very passionate about, that I had the honor, absolute great honor to be affiliated with since 2018 and even before that. I want to tell you a little story. How did it all start? Many, many years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Luc Albinski. He is a friend, he's a colleague, he is one of the people that is greatly, greatly involved in the work of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. I learned about his dear mother, Wanda Albinski, a survivor, a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto. I had the pleasure to meet her. And hello, Wanda, I know that you are with us today all the way from Warsaw. And he told me about a wonderful, wonderful writer sitting in Warsaw, Maria Ciesielska, who just published a book in Polish about the doctors of the Warsaw Ghetto, that she really did it for many years herself, self-published, and got it out. And this book is so, so important because it tells the story that was not so well known until then. The prehistory, before the Holocaust, the history of the Holocaust, of the doctors, and brings documents and statistics and brings to the fore the short even bios of those doctors. And there we were, going on March of the Living in 2018, and speaking about the need to translate the book to English. And there is Michael Berenbaum marching with us to Auschwitz. And I said to Luc, my friend, and to Wanda, his mom, let's talk to Michael. And Michael Berenbaum heard about Maria's book, met Maria in Warsaw, and together we decided to edit and publish the book in English. The book came out in May and June. It is The Doctors of the Warsaw Ghetto by Maria Ciesielska. And I had the absolute honor to be one of the editors together with Jeanette Friedman and Luc Albinski, and for Michael Berenbaum, our good friend and colleague, to do the foreword together with Luc Albinski. It was a work of love. The book is available in hardcover and in softcover, and we'll put a link in the chat. And there is no one better to tell you about this work of passion and love than its author, its original author in Polish, and its author that I now call my friend and colleague, Dr. Maria Ciesielska. Professor Maria Ciesielska is a historian of medicine and practicing physician. She's also the vice director for the Medical Review Auschwitz Project and vice president of the Polish Society for the History of Medical Sciences. She has published articles related to the fate of physicians during World War II, with particular emphasis on medical issues related to the Nazi concentration camps, the Gestapo prisons, and the hospitals in the Warsaw Ghetto. Professor Ciesielska's latest book, Doctors of the Warsaw Ghetto, was awarded with the Maria and Lukasz Hirschowitz Award, granted by the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. Maria, it is an honor to have you here, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Tali. Thank you for your inspiring introduction, for all the warm words. I would rather talk about Jewish doctors, not about myself, nor about the book. I want to start with a very personal intro. Many years ago, I saw some questionnaires filled in by Jewish doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto. The questionnaires included photos of their faces. For the first time, I saw them and I couldn't forget. Same as me, quite young but mature. They wrote that they had wives, husbands, and children, just like me. They wrote that they earned little, but they were still interested in medicine. Some mentioned the titles of scientific papers. I was already working in research then too. There were so many similarities, but where was I supposed to look for these doctors? Who were they? Where had they gone? What happened? Hundreds of memoirs were written during the 70 years after the war ended. Thousands of accounts were articulated, and many studies were conducted and published on the history of the Warsaw Ghetto. All accounts and memoirs written during or immediately after the war by medical personnel thus remain invaluable sources of information on their work in the hospitals and polyclinics of the Warsaw Ghetto. I will mention just few of them. Dr. Adina Blady-Schweiter and her book, And I Remember Nothing More. Professor Ludwig Hirschfeld, A Story of One Life. Dr. Henryk Makover, His Memories of the Warsaw Ghetto. Dr. Noemi Makover, Love in the Shadow of Death, Recollections from the Warsaw Ghetto. Dr. Zofia Szymańska, I Was Only a Doctor. Individual researchers have focused on the fate of prominent doctors of Jewish origin. For example, Agnieszka Witkowska-Krych wrote papers on Dr. Anna Braude-Hellerowa, who was a pediatrician and who worked for many years as director of the Berson and Bauman Hospital for Jewish Children in Warsaw. She supervised the institution up to its last moments in spring 1943. Naomi Menuhin, for example, is the author of Dr. Israel Milejkowski's biography. Dr. Milejkowski was a dermatologist, head of the health department of the Judenrat and of the hospital department of the Jewish Medical Council in the ghetto. He initiated the hunger studies in the ghetto and the ghetto clandestine medical school. He was deported to Treblinka in January 1942. But to fully understand their story, one must consider the years before the war. This period was important to what happened during the war. Soon after the end of the First World War, nationalist groups in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary attempted to introduce numerus clausus, quota systems, as institutions of higher learning affecting Jews and other minorities. A quota system restricted the admission of Jews into Polish medical schools. Polish nationalists wanted to Polonize the profession. It was called disjewification. In 1938, anti-Jewish policies and the Aryan clause in the medical fraternity led to admission limits and Jews not being appointed to academic posts. At Warsaw University, the Association of Assistants adopted the Aryan clause by asking the rector not to appoint Jews to positions of professor, docent, and assistant. Some Jews understood that being Jewish was a handicap and were anxious to rid themselves of that inconvenience, so they converted just to make it possible to advance their careers. For those less committed to Jewish tradition, less tied to their Jewish family or to the Jewish people, conversion was a way of assimilating and participating in one's chosen profession and in the greater society with fewer obstacles to advancement. Such former Jews were not universally accepted. They were in a state of what one today might call conditional Polishness. After conversion, one might still be considered a social Jew with the benefit of official conversion that diminished most legal and ethic forms of discrimination until the Germans arrived. When the Germans invaded Poland and every other country, they imposed the Nuremberg Clause of 1935, defining Jews by race and not by identity or religion in occupied territory. Converts once again found themselves legally defined as Jews. There was no escape, and once Jews in Poland were confined to ghettos, converted doctors suddenly found themselves ghettoized, precisely among the people they wanted to avoid. Betrayed by the Germans and often by their Polish colleagues, they in turn found themselves considered traitors by many of the Jews they treated. The loss of status was dramatic, their sense of alienation acute. Because Jewish doctors trained with their non-Jewish colleagues and worked with them when in hospitals and in practice, they knew the difference between colleagues who were hostile, those who were timid, and those who might be willing to help them survive. Such knowledge, such cultural fluency empowered them to seek cooperation or shelter during the Holocaust and even after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, when they hit on the so-called Aryan side. Yet, because they were in contact with non-Jewish colleagues and patients, they were easy to spot and identify when they were on the Aryan side. They were more easily outed, betrayed, and or blackmailed. The 4 years of German occupation were a series of stages preceding ghettoization and then the multiple stages of manipulating conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto itself. There were 6 stages to Jewish life in the Warsaw Ghetto, and each is reflected in different dilemmas. The first stage was the process of moving in when everything was in turmoil, personally and professionally, because the ghetto was established in a rundown and impoverished section of Warsaw, and because many physicians were economically better off, many had to find a place to live. Those who were intermarried faced a crisis regarding the fate of their spouse, separate or stay. And what of the children, considered Mischlinge in Nazi speak? By law, they were mixed breeds, but often they considered themselves as socially and culturally assimilated Poles. Jewish doctors, whether by race or religion, were forced to move into the ghetto or hide. The separate chamber of physicians for Jewish physicians, so-called National Group of Jewish Physicians, was created soon after the ghetto was closed. Israel Milekowski became its chairman. Dividing physicians into 2 separate national groups was possible because each physician registered in the chamber was obliged to fill the questionnaire for the first report of medical professions, in German Fragebogen zur erstmaligen Meldung der Heilberufe, which contained a written background declaration. According to the racial laws proclaimed by the German Reichstag, including the law concerning the citizenship of the Reich, everyone who had 3 or more grandparents who had been racially completely Jews were considered a Jew. A descendant of 2 Jewish grandparents was considered a first degree half-breed, and that who had 1 Jewish grandparent, a second degree half-breed. Religious affiliation was not taken into consideration. In addition, in the occupied Poland, Germans introduced on July 24, 1940, a decree according to which the first degree half-breeds, as well as those who before September 1st belonged to a Jewish community or had a Jewish spouse, were also considered Jews. The construction of the questionnaire reflected the decree. In order to conduct a practice and treat Aryan patients, one had to prove pure Aryan background and fill out appropriate sections concerning the background and religion of grandparents. If a physician was considered Jew, This fact was recorded on the first page of the questionnaire by an annotation Jude, means Jew. Before the war, the doctors had worked in 23 hospitals or institutes, the clinics of Warsaw University, in health centers and outpatient city clinics, in emergency medical services, and in private practices, usually located in a home office or in a private clinics. When the ghetto was sealed off, many of those clinics were located on the so-called Aryan side. This limited significantly the access of a large group of assimilated physicians who for years had been working in the city hospitals or had conducted their own profitable offices to the possibility of earning money. The sealing of the ghetto left the old order Jewish hospital on the Aryan side, and some doctors received passes allowing them to leave the ghetto to work. In December 1940, the Germans ordered the hospital to move into the ghetto. When the hospital moved to the ghetto at the end of January 1941, its three surgical, laryngology, and radiology departments were relocated to 1 Leszno Street. The internal and infectious diseases departments and the analytical and pathological laboratories were moved to the city's old archives building and the adjacent elementary school at 68 Stawki Street. Internal diseases and the bacteriological laboratory were moved to 21 Stawki Street. With the move into the ghetto, the hospital was renamed the Czyste Jewish Hospital for Infectious Diseases. Dr. Józef Stein became its director. When the ghetto was sealed off, the Berson and Baumann Children's Hospital became part of the so-called small ghetto, with Dr. Braude-Hellerova remaining as director. Initially functioning without being subjected to harassment, the situation deteriorated very quickly. In October 1941, it became possible to open a branch of the Children's Hospital on the corner of Żelazna and Leszno Street, where they accommodated 400 children. By winter 1941-42, the hospital was in a lamentable condition. There was no space for patients to die in peace. I will show you the questionnaire because it is important. This is the questionnaire I mentioned before. And the Jewish hospital in the ghetto, and the Children's Hospital, and its branch on Żelazna Street. When the ghetto was sealed off, the Berson-Baumann's Czyste Hospital became part of the small ghetto, as I mentioned. The second stage to the Jewish life in the Warsaw Ghetto was settling in for an identified future with little known about what the future might bring. The only thing that was certain was that the next day would be worse, and it always was. The goals of everyone in the ghetto, physicians included, were stabilization and survival. The conditions of treatment of sick people in hospitals in the ghetto, as well as of those who were reporting to dispensaries, were deteriorating from week to week due to total deficiency of medications, dressings, and medical tools, as well as to hunger and constant typhus epidemic. With time, medical treatment became limited to the basic dressings activities performed in the constantly shrinking number of medical institutions. In these extremely difficult conditions, physicians were also taking part in secret training of students of medicine, as well in research on hunger disease. The third stage was the period when rumors about deportation took hold and everyone began to sense that the end was near. The pressure on every ghetto inhabitant was intense. Life and death hung in the balance. Where will they send us? What will that mean? To medical personnel, this issue was both professional and personal. What does a doctor do with his or her family? Will they be exempt? What does a physician do with his or her patients? Medical ethics were even more challenged from now on. Triage took on a whole new meaning. They had to choose who would live and who would die. The fourth stage was the Great Deportation, which occurred between July 22nd and September 29, 1942. At least 265,000 souls were deported from Warsaw to Treblinka death camp. There was no selection there. All were condemned to death. Perhaps less than one person in 1,000, a carpenter or a jeweler or some other useful worker, would be chosen to work in the camp. The Jewish doctors working in the Warsaw Ghetto, as well as their families and patients, were also transported to their final destination in overcrowded sealed boxcars sprinkled with lime, which made it difficult to breathe. Some chose to end their lives by committing suicide, or they helped others to die. The fifth stage was the time between the Great Deportation and the start of the ghetto uprising. At the time, no one could imagine a positive future. It was assumed that if one worked and one's work was deemed useful, one might live a bit longer. Surviving medical personnel had to adjust again, less assured of a distinct status, less equipped to continue their work. On September 6, 1942, Dr. Józef Stein, the director of the Czyste Hospital, was ordered to have all the hospital personnel report for duty before noon for the final selection. Everyone knew it was a death sentence. Nobody knew what to do. Most were at a loss. Dr. Polisiuk recalled, almost all of us went with our director in the lead as the final group left the hospital. In a secret meeting, the group consisting of the hospital management compiled lists with the names of those who would remain in the ghetto. This group had to decide the fate of 800 people. Those selected had to be viable for the possible future hospital. They were to receive temporary right to live in form of tickets. The rest were to be deported to Treblinka. Dr. Waller recalled, this is a citation, when Dr. Stein appeared in the backyard, he was immediately surrounded by hundreds of people. He was one of those compiling the list of those eligible for tickets to life. I caught up with Dr. Stein in the crowd and asked him whether I could count on such vouchers for myself and my family, wife and son. He told me I would not receive any. In despair, I caught him by his jacket lapels with such force that I tore them and began to emphasize my value to the hospital. Thereafter, he promised I would receive the tickets. Others had no such luck. In the yard of the building on Dzika Street, I met the shattered doctors Markus Feld and Rothstadt, who had no chance of receiving vouchers because of their advanced age. At 5 a.m. on September 7th, people were rounded up and a list of names was read out. For the 500 employees, there were 200 live tickets. Because nobody in management wanted to read it out, Dr. Stein ordered Dr. Adolf Polisiuk to do it. The list contained the names of 25 or 30 doctors, 10 clerks, 1,000 or so nurses. It was, as Dr. Polisiuk wrote, the most tragic moment of his life, because while reading the list, he was, in a way, pronouncing death sentences on innocent people, close friends, colleagues, co-workers, and even his own boss. He read the list several times because people could not believe that they had been excluded. Dr. Stanisław Waller did not receive the ticket for his wife and son, which Dr. Stein has promised him. He decided to inject his son with a large dose of pantopon and carry him sleeping in his backpack. Unfortunately, it had unexpected results. After the injection, the child began screaming, drawing unwanted attention. Fortunately, the mother and baby were saved by the ambulance driver who drove them to the hospital on Stawki Street, where they were later joined by Dr. Waller, who managed to survive. On September 12, all patients and remaining hospital personnel boarded the boxcars. Even those who had tickets and stayed in the hospital on Stawki to tend to their patients to the very end were also deported. A small group of surviving doctors and nurses stayed in the buildings on Gęsia Street and established the last hospital in the ghetto. Desperate as all were desperate, anxious as all were anxious, they sought to find a way to survive and plan what to do. A number of doctors left the ghetto to hide on the Aryan side, but not everyone found the promised help on the other side. Those who decided to remain in the ghetto began preparing bunkers and hideouts. All hideouts quickly filled up during the first days of the ghetto uprising that began on April 19, 1943, the sixth stage of the ghetto history. Unfortunately, the Germans discovered the shelter after a couple of days and called for everyone to leave their shelter, promising them safe exit to the east. Bunker under the ruined building of Gęsia Street, there were 130 people, including Dr. Stein and Dr. Brauda-Hellerowa. On April 21st, Doctors Bielenki, Borkowski, and Fenigstein and their wives responded to the Germans' call. They exited the hiding places and were brought to the Umschlagplatz. According to post-war accounts, Dr. Bielenki was sent to the Trawniki camp, where he worked as a camp doctor. In 1943, testimonial Paweł Reimann wrote during the fall of 1943, under the pretext of being released from the camp and going abroad, Bielenki was transferred by car to Majdanek, where he was shot, most probably during the November Erntefest, the Harvest Festival, a German code name for the mass killing of Jews in Majdanek in November 1943. Fenigstein's situation was somewhat peculiar. He bribed an SS officer, offering him his collection of postage stamps and a commitment to complete it with the missing pieces in exchange for a promise to be sent to a labor camp instead of Treblinka. And so it happened. The fate of Dr. Borkowski remains unknown. In the morning of April 1922, on the fourth day of the uprising, the hospital was set on fire. Those who opted to lock themselves in probably burned to death. A handful of hospital personnel, some 15 people, and Dr. Rod Balsam, laboratory assistant Feiga Fersht, and Dr. Rivka Elbinger, with her family, went to the shelter in the cellar. Initially, they tried to cover the entrance with sand, but without success, because one wing of the hospital was still undamaged. They decided to go there. Running through the wards, they saw patients shot dead in their beds. On the first floor, they found a way out into the yard, and from there, searched for other bunkers. Following a hazardous route, they reached a cellar where some hospital patients found shelter and agreed to let them in. They remained there until May 11th. On that day, some assessment threw a grenade into the bunker where Dr. Balsam was hiding. Luckily, people backed away immediately and only one person was injured. The bunker was shown to the Germans by a Jew who had been hiding nearby, and he was rewarded with a bowl of soup. 2 days later, he too was brought to the Umschlagplatz. By mid-May, almost all the houses in the area were in ruins. Those found hiding in shelters were taken to the Umschlagplatz, to a prison called Gęsiówka. Those who refused to leave the shelter were either shot on the spot or suffocated when gas was pumped into the cellars. Little is known about the fate of Dr. Anna Braude-Hellerowa. According to an account included in the memoirs of Luba Blum-Bielicka, the shelter where she was hiding burned down. Some people managed to run away and hide in the vicinity of the hospital. Among them were Doctors Braude-Heller, Polisiuk, and Gittler. Facing the magnitude of their tragedy, they lost all hope of surviving. Expecting that their sanctuary would be revealed, they dispersed. Today, it is impossible to establish under what circumstances and when she died. Her sister, Judyta Braude, wrote that she had cyanide with her and hoped she had a chance to use it. It is possible that Dr. Braude-Hellerowa died with her other sister, Róża Afterhood. Friends of Dr. Hellerowa tried to save her, preparing fake documents and offering her a safe house, but she declined their help. Dr. Blade Schweiger remembered that in her final letter from the ghetto, dated March 1943, Braude-Hellerowa wrote, "Do not worry about me. I have made my plans." Barely several dozen Jewish physicians reported to the Chamber of Physicians in Warsaw in order to register or to obtain a copy of their medical diplomas after the war. According to my estimates, only 103 of them lived to see the end of the war, a mere 12%. 88% of them perished in the ghetto and in Treblinka. Rahela Auerbach was one of the few resistance fighters to survive the ghetto uprising. She ran a soup kitchen in the ghetto. She was a sensitive observer of her own situation and of the people she served. In February 1942, a mere 5 months before the Great Deportation, she wrote in her diary, "We are powerless. We are working in a vacuum. The only outcome of our work may be the fact that the whole ghetto will not die out all at once. The death is regulated in some way that we can more or less keep up with burying the bodies. We are incapable of changing anyone's fate." Thank you very much, and I'm very sorry for the inconvenience with the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you, Tali, Madine, and Hadas. Thank you.
For all those that want to see many of those pictures, many of the forms, so much more, the book is full of those accounts, personal accounts, many quotes, many of the questions that already came in the chat are really answered in the book. And there are the stories of the medical university in the Warsaw Ghetto and its students. There is the account of the nursing school. There is an account by Maria of many of the stages in much more detail. So I do hope that you read the book and learn more about this amazing chapter of the Warsaw Ghetto. So I told you, I shared with you how the book came about. And now, as I'm going to introduce Luc Albinski to you, I will tell you that then when we decided in 2018 to translate the book and edit the book to English, we also decided to film a short film and to really for the first time interview Wanda Albinski. She was never interviewed before. She was one of those survivors that didn't tell her story and didn't share her story for many, many years. But thanks to her son, Luc, which you will meet now, we managed to interview her. And thanks to the wonderful director, Sean O'Sullivan from Cape Town, South Africa, and thanks to Dr. Stephen Smith, that many of you know, that was the director of the USC Shoah Foundation until December of last year, we managed to create a short film that I hope many of you watched, called Nobody Told Me. We will watch a trailer of the film, and then Luc will share with us more about his life and the life of his grandmother, Dr. Halina Rothstein, who sadly was murdered in Treblinka in September of 1942, exactly 80 years ago. The film was finalized during COVID, and it is just out in the last few months this year. And Adam, please, if we can share the trailer of the film.
My mother, I suppose she was socialist, and I don't know if she was no Jewish, no Polish. She was just atheist, I suppose. We live all in beautiful house with my mother, never shouting at us, never being very angry and anything. When I see the German, I was so frightened. I didn't know where to get out from seeing them. And after, everybody was supposed to go to the ghetto.
Dr. Halina Rothstein, she's a doctor inside the ghetto. By 1941, the first typhus epidemic is spreading. The doctors are working night and day.
She worked in hospital. Then a basement was small room for us, and we get there with my mother. You see,
Halina knows she needs to save her children. Through working with the underground and with people helping the Jews, Wanda and her brothers managed to get out.
It took extremely brave people to risk their lives to save Jews. The penalty was death, there was no question. If you were caught aiding Jews, you would die, your spouse would die, and your children would die as a result of it.
These people made promises to each other which were of a different nature from an everyday promise.
So I hope that you watch the film, and if not, there is still time to watch the film. And it does tell a story that is not often told. And to tell us more, I would like to introduce Luc Albinski. Luc is a second-generation Holocaust survivor who was brought up as a Catholic only learning about his Jewish origins in his early 20s. Since then, he has spent much time researching the fate of his Polish Jewish grandmother, Dr. Halina Rothstein, a doctor in the Warsaw Ghetto, who decided to accompany her patients to the Treblinka death camp and her death. Luc is very dedicated to human rights issues. He spent a lot of time in Bosnia. As I said before, he dedicates a lot of his time to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And he lives in Johannesburg, and he will share more about his story with us now. Luc, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tali. But firstly, I would like to just thank you, Tali, for your tremendous contribution to this film. I mean, your warmth and your interest in the story and how you mastered it and in all its details is really a big reason why this film is as compelling as it is. And of course, you helped to enroll Stephen Smith into the project, and his subject knowledge and his communication skills are quite remarkable too. And I also just want to quickly thank Jonathan Andrews and most importantly, Sean O'Sullivan, who spent so much time on this film, editing it, re-editing it, finding incredible. Sean found some incredible archival footage by getting in touch with Sam Bryan, Julian's son, and also reaching out to the Holocaust Archive in Washington, the Steven Spielberg Film and Video Archive, and the German Bundesarchive. And also then thank Niani Neto and Kirsty Gayod and Alan Roberts from 5 Star Media. So it's really been a team project, people. So I just wanted to say a few words about Julian Bryan, because he was a remarkable individual, and that footage that we have of Warsaw being bombed is really his footage. He was the last journalist in Warsaw during the siege of Warsaw. He left Warsaw in September 21, on the 21st of September, and to get all this valuable footage out, also he actually wrapped it around his body, hiding it from the Germans so he could take it out. And then the footage you see at the end of the film, with Warsaw in ruin, and there's remarkable pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto, are also his, because he came back to Warsaw in 1946 as part of a UN refugee agency group, and filmed those remarkable pictures of Warsaw in ruins after the war. So we're really deeply indebted to him. As I said, he was the last journalist in Warsaw. He actually slept in the US consulate in Warsaw that was abandoned. All the diplomats had left, and he was the only inhabitant of the US consulate in Warsaw during the siege of Warsaw. So really a remarkable individual. I just thought we should honor him. Let me try and share my screen. I don't know if it's going to be possible given the weak connectivity, so let me know. So a lot of people ask me about the journey, learning about my Jewish identity and investigating the story of my grandmother. So I thought I'll just share you a couple of quick slides about the way I was brought up and how I discovered all this information about my past and the journey that you, Tali, have been such a big part of in kind of bringing to light all these facts about Halina, and also about my family, my Jewish family and Jewish past in Poland. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah?
We will let you know if not. So just go on. Thank you.
So things start with language, and I was very fortunate to learn Polish from my parents. It's a very difficult language, as you can see, and then I was brought up Catholic, and I used to attend the St. Joseph's the Worker Church in Norwood. And a huge impact in my life was my Catholic grandmother, Janina. And at this time, I had no inkling of the other side of the family and of Halina's origins. The story that my grandma used to tell us was about the train where they left Warsaw as Warsaw was being besieged for the East. My grandfather on the Catholic side was a high-ranking official in the transport ministry. They left on this government train. And when the train stopped, they went to a hotel nearby. When they woke up, the Soviets had arrived. And the hotel manager had the good sense to destroy the guest book. Otherwise, they would have all been picked up by the NKVD. And then they spent a few weeks walking back to Warsaw. So they actually decided to guide back to Warsaw and to now Nazi-occupied Warsaw. That's a picture of my grandfather. And they lived in a suburb called Włochy. And Włochy did not participate in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, but the Germans decided nonetheless to preemptively arrest a few thousand men in Włochy. And so my Polish Catholic grandfather ended up in Auschwitz in mid-September 1944, and then he died in Buchenwald in 28th of December 1944. Recently visited Buchenwald after spending time with Tali when she got her Goethe Prize, which was a great honor for me. And then my great uncle Mietek, who fought in the Warsaw Uprising, ended up in Germany and never came back to Poland. It was too dangerous for him to come back to Poland. And my first trip to Poland in April 1990, still completely unaware of the Jewish side of my family. My mom hadn't told me a word about it. I knew nothing. What I've just told you is what I knew about my Polish past and Polish origins. And then I had a conversation with my cousins, and they told me about Halina, and they pointed me to this book written by Henryk Makover, where he describes Halina and how she took control of everything in the hospital, and then helped the patients transport themselves to the death trains. And obviously that was a huge shock for me. I hadn't heard anything about this before. And then I had to engage in some difficult conversations with my mom to try and understand why she hadn't told me anything, and my dad. And you can imagine that those were fairly difficult conversations to begin with. But eventually my mom started to open up and engage with the sub. Then we learned that their son, Mieczysław, had the Chrysler dealership for the whole of Poland. And had Chrysler dealerships in 6 or 8 of the biggest cities in Poland, and funded the first endurance race in Poland, car endurance race in 1928. 6-day endurance race was funded by my grandfather's family. And we learned about the Kutno chemicals plant, which there's my mom looking in at it today, or a few years back now. And we learned that it was doing some really groundbreaking work converting potatoes into synthetic rubber. And that technology was technology was so extraordinary that it featured in the 1939 New York Expo. And as a result of that, my uncle and his family survived the Holocaust. They were given papers by the British Secret Service to leave Nazi-occupied Poland and leave occupied Europe and go to the US to help the US with their synthetic rubber program. But most of all, I learned about Halina. Halina in the 20s was born, and her three brothers. Stash was born in Warsaw, but her two other brothers were born in Kutno. And then, of course, the tragic Halina in the ghetto, working day and night at the Stavky hospital, and eventually deciding ghetto walls. We try to commemorate this. There's a plaque in honor of Halina at the Johannesburg Holocaust Genocide Center. This picture is part of the permanent exhibition there. And of course, we're deeply, deeply indebted to Maria, who furnished so much additional information that we were unaware of. For example, until I read Maria's book, I didn't know that Halina had been involved in a little wooden shed on the Umschlagplatz, helping people that had been injured with first aid on the Umschlagplatz. It's just very difficult to imagine such a situation. And picking up infants that were abandoned on the railway platforms by their parents, picking up those infants and tending to them on the Umschlagplatz. This was something that Maria told us. And so we just have this incredible debt of gratitude towards her for her work and assistance in her research. And this is the Stavky Street Hospital where my grandmother Halina worked and was in charge at some point of things there when there were very few doctors left. And the story how she put someone in charge of the storage room so that the food wouldn't get stolen, and how she operated on people who had been shot. It's just very difficult to imagine this scale of the responsibilities that she had to shoulder. And then her decision to go with her patients to her death on 12 September 1942. We also investigated with my mom escape. This is the courthouse building through which she was taken by Natalia Radlinska out onto the Aryan side. And these are the righteous among the Gentiles that saved her and her brothers, Andrzej Trojanowski, Natalia Radlinska, and we reconnected, and my mom reconnected with Eva Trojanowska. 80 years later, they reconnected. She's there in the picture with my mom. The first time my mom met Eva was when she was hiding on the Aryan side in Trojanowski's apartment, and Eva was playing with her, and reconnected 80 years later. These people that saved my mom and her brother's lives. We also learned more about my mom's life in Anusha's home, a remarkable orphanage where and she and her brothers had the most remarkable education there. We went with Tali, we went to Treblinka, where my grandmother was killed. And these are Halina's great-grandchildren. Thanks to those righteous among the nations, all these youngsters exist today. We also reconnected with our US family. As you recall, Mieczysław Rothstein was smuggled out of Poland and out of wartime Europe together with his family because he had that remarkable synthetic rubber technology that he had developed in Kutno. And there was a whole family in the US that was completely unaware of this whole story. And thanks to the research we did and the book we wrote, we were able to reconnect with them. It was also very... So to summarize, you know, in this book, The Warsaw Covenants that I wrote, I thought the theme of the covenants is really one which kind of permeated my thinking about these events. Kalina had this incredible covenant with the patients under her care, which ultimately chose her to choose to go with them to their deaths rather than to try and save herself. Andrzej Trojanowski, the righteous among the nations, had this covenant with the frightened children, my mom and her brothers, which he hid at risk to his own life and the life of his family. I think of my great-uncle Mietek. He had a covenant with his fellow Armia Krajowa fighters who were fighting in Wola district, then in the central district, against overwhelming odds. And he was never returned to Poland after he survived and was put in a prisoner of war camp in Germany. For Polish Catholics, there was the covenant with the Queen Protectress of Poland, Mary. For Polish Jews, the covenant with the God of Israel. But all these covenants, I feel, were sacred covenants that endured the worst of times.
Thank you very much, Luc. I'm sorry the connection was not very good, but we could see the slides and we could follow most of it. So thank you very much for sharing, and thank you so much for sharing the complex identity and all your discoveries through the years, so openly and so honestly with all of us. I think it's special, and we do appreciate it very much. To end our amazing event tonight, it is such an honor to have a Holocaust survivor sharing some recollections, some connections with us, not only a Holocaust survivor, but also a doctor himself. And that is Dr. Michael Katz, who was born in Poland in 1928, who experienced the German occupation in Warsaw and in Lvov and in Krakow, who lost his entire family in Lvov and in Belzec killing center, but escaped the Janowska camp and lived as a Roman Catholic in Warsaw and became a member of the resistance and fought in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. He evacuated from Warsaw to Krakow, liberated there in January of 1945 by the Soviet army. And after that, and after his time in the DP camps, he immigrated to the United States, to New York in May 46. And then after his studies and lots of studies, different studies, he became an expert in pediatrics, public health, and global health, and served in many universities, including as professor and chairman of the Department of Pediatrics at Columbia University. Now, Michael will reflect with us for a few minutes about his medical school classmate, Dr. Myron Winnick, that was actually also in Columbia University, but as a nutritionist and the director of Columbia's Institute of Nutrition, who actually translated the research done in the ghetto on hunger disease that we started with and we wanted to end with. So, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I assume you can hear me all right. I just have a few comments to make. One of them is that Dr. Myron Winnick, the late Dr. Myron Winnick, my colleague in medical school, brought with him from a visit to Warsaw a original text of a book called Hunger Disease, which was created by a variety of physicians working under the circumstances of the ghetto and suffering themselves from enormous deprivation of food. That book was phenomenal in its original detail of how the process of malnutrition ultimately ended in the deaths of people who were starving. The quantity of food offered per person in the Warsaw Ghetto was insufficient to support any life. And that remarkable document by people who knew that they were dying, but wanted to leave the scientific information and devoted themselves with great deal of perfection to documenting it. One of the critiques of that book, unfortunately, by Science, which is the journal of the American Society for the Advancement of Science, failed to understand the heroism of people who, in spite of their own impending death, documented what they could with accuracy. They were criticized, and for that I would only quote or suggest a metaphor. The criticism of them would have been equivalent to people being strangled and writing the details of the process of strangulation while they're being killed. So that must never be forgotten. And I want to praise them for that and thank the memory of Dr. Winnick for making it possible. I have one additional comment, if you will permit me. Missing from this very good presentation was one major Polish physician, a pediatrician, who wrote wonderful short stories and tales for children. His name was Janusz Korczak. That was his pseudonym, nom de plume, but his real name was Dr. Henryk Goldschmidt, and he was a pediatrician who ran a interesting nursery and in the ghetto as well as before. He was offered an opportunity to be saved and refused to do by the Germans. He would refuse to do that, and he went with them to Treblinka, where he was killed by an injection of phenol into his heart. That was essentially what I meant to say, and my tribute to all of these people in the time limited. But thank you for allowing me to make this comment.
Thank you very much, Michael, for adding your comments and reflection, not only as a Holocaust survivor yourself, but as a doctor and someone that worked closely with your colleague, Dr. Winnick, in the connection to the hunger disease. And I think your last comment is also really important because as you told the story of the very famous Dr. Janusz Korczak, of course, the only one that his actual name is mentioned in Treblinka, all the rest of the stones are of communities and countries, and the only person mentioned by name is Henryk Goldschmidt, Dr. Janusz Korczak, and the children. I think that it is a good way to end by saying that many of the doctors, many of the heads of orphanages in the Warsaw Ghetto were offered that way out. And maybe let's talk about Dr. Halina Rothstein, that after smuggling her 4 little children, she was offered many, many times a way out, but chose to stay with her patients and chose to go to Treblinka, knowing full well what Treblinka meant in September of 1942. So I think the heroism and the resistance in that act is extremely important for us to remember not only the courageous Janusz Korczak, but the courageous Halina Rothstein, the courageous Dr. Heller, the courageous other doctors that we, thanks to the work of Maria Ciesielska and many others, Hadas Shasha-Lavksy and many, many others, Miriam Ofer and many others who wrote fantastic research and important work, we now know. We know the almost 1,000 doctors of the Warsaw Ghetto, and we should remember them. Medin, back to you.
Okay, thank you again, Tali, for hosting your friends, actually, friends and people that you worked with to help bring this program together. We do have a few questions. I think that there's one question that I wanted to put to Maria about these tickets to life. And maybe it's a connection to what we were just talking about with Dr. Katz. Who decided that a doctor would get a ticket of life? And what did it mean in the end? In the end, we understand what it meant. It meant absolutely nothing, right? But at least during the time that people were alive, who gave them, who made the decision, who chose, who was to get one and who wasn't?
Thank you, Noam, for this question. It is a very important one. I didn't have enough time to describe the situation completely, but this is another story about the choiceless choices. Right. The question is if it was made entirely by the Commission or also by the Germans. The answer is that it was made entirely by the Commission, by the Jewish Commission made of Jewish doctors, but it was an order. It was a choiceless choice. And at the very beginning, Dr. Stein, the main director of the Jewish Ciesielska hospital, decided to do it. Dr. Braude-Hellerova, the vice director, she didn't want to make the decision. But some young doctors, especially pediatricians of her ward, asked her to do so. And we know, and it was remembered, that she decided to give her part of tickets to the youngest. And this is how many young doctors from Bersen and Bauman's hospital survived this stage of the ghetto history. Only 200 tickets were given, but as I mentioned, there were a lot of situations that Germans didn't, take it under consideration. And also many Jewish doctors, nurses, and other employees of the hospital perished, though they have their cards. It is called sometimes tickets, sometimes it is called cards. Some people remember it was green, others remember it was yellow. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It was only a short story of the ghetto, and the final stage was death. And even among these 200s, 90% perished. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer, and thank you for the question in our audience. Someone actually asked if there was records of the patients that remained. Is there any information that was left about the actual patients that were in the hospitals?
Okay, again, me.
It's for
With
you.
pleasure. No, we don't have any documents about patients. We have some documents, the death certificates. I think that 2 weeks ago they were mentioned during the presentation, but all documents were, just ruined. Everything disappeared during the uprising, and again 1 year later during the Warsaw uprising. So we don't have any. We have only testimonies, and we have these questionnaires I mentioned before, which in my opinion are sometimes in 90% the last and only traces of these doctors. And I think there were more than 900 doctors living and working in the ghetto. And most of them are in the main medical library in Warsaw. And the pictures I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation can be seen there. And believe me, I was a witness of many situations that people who went there to see the questionnaires were able to see the faces of their grandfathers and grandmothers for the first time in their lives. So in my opinion, the most important thing about the book, about my presentation, is to tell the world that if you have any grandfather, grandmother, doctor living and working in the ghetto, and if you don't have any picture of them, go to Warsaw, visit the main medical library, because maybe you will find a picture of your ancestor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And by the way, at least 2 people in the audience said that they are connected to doctors that were in the Warsaw Ghetto. So we already have that connection. I know that you also mentioned that as well. We do have a question. There are 2 questions for Luc. I think the movie answers the question, but one question is, what happened to your grandfather, Helena's husband? And a second question, I guess the question that is being asked, how do you deal with the double identity, you know, of being raised Catholic, but also having discovered your Jewish heritage? So someone asked that question as well. So first of all, what happened to your grandfather, Helena's husband, and a little bit about your identity today.
So Władysław Rothstein ended up staying in the Soviet Union. He lived there, and he had another family in the Soviet Union. He worked as an engineer in very, very, very modest surroundings for many, many years, but eventually ending up in Rostov-on-the-Don. He did see his children, though. My mom and her brothers visited him in the Soviet Union. He also was allowed late in his life to come, but essentially he became a citizen of the Soviet Union in the Soviet Union. So that's what happened to Władysław. In terms of the identity question, you know, all I was going to say about identities is that I've made it a kind of a life motto that it's not an either or. It's a plurality of identities where you embrace your various identities and you explore them and you see the interrelationships. It's not I don't feel there's any need for an exclusionary identity. Don't know if that makes sense to you, Madine, but that's my view.
First of all, I went out of a spotlight and I can see the audience and I see people shaking their heads. And the first thing that comes to mind is it's a gift. This opportunity to have this merging of different identities and to use it to tell your personal story, but also have the message that you have of the covenants, I think, is incredible. So yes, I absolutely understand what you were saying.
And you know, in some ways, when you have people on both sides of your family, on the Polish Catholic side and on the Polish Jewish side, dying in different concentration camps, you kind of hold within you the tragedies of all of Poland, of Polish Jewish citizens, of Polish Catholic citizens. It's all of Poland that you hold within you.
And I think that is a great way to end our program. I think that's wonderful that we're able to say that. And it's true, very true, to be able to look at different perspectives, which is one of the things that we wanted to do with this series. Once again, I want to thank all of our incredible speakers. And I also want to thank Dr. Hadas Shasha-Lavksy for giving her opening remarks, and Tali for being an amazing, as always, moderator for this program. Tali put information about the book. I highly recommend reading Maria's book as well to get more information about the doctors. And I think it'll be incredible. And also, Michael Katz, thank you so much for sharing your personal story. Like Tali said, to have a survivor with us is probably the greatest reward that we can have from these types of weird virtual programs that we do. And I want to thank our audience once again for being with us today. We will be back on October 23rd, but until then, we will be going through the high holidays here in Israel and for the Jewish community around the world. So for those that celebrate and recognize the Jewish New Year, Shana Tova. And for those that don't, we want to wish you a happy New Year, a happy fall, and we will see everyone in about a month. So, shalom, and thank you.